one of the groups that puts these speaker series on, along with U.S. Forestry, State Forestry, Village, BIA, County. I'm probably missing a few organizations, South Central Mountain RCD, missing a few organizations there. I just wanted to mention real briefly that we're really excited about a grant that we were just awarded by P&M. And I think Marianne mentioned we'd applied at the last meeting, but we found out we had actually been awarded, and the award is actually going to Friends of Smoky. They're the 501c3 that's working, or being our facilitator of the funds until we get our 501c3 status. So we're working together with them and the Village and the Chamber of Commerce. We're going to get a digital LED sign, a two-sided sign that we'll put down at the Chamber of Commerce. It's about 2 feet high and about 10 feet wide. It will replace the marquee that's there now. And we'll be able to broadcast different fire information, messages about fire safety and defensible space, along with messaging of the Chamber of Commerce, water restrictions, that kind of thing. So there's a $15,000 grant, and we'll be implementing that and getting that sign up. Our deadline is October 1st. So we're real excited about that and working with all these other agencies. Now I'm going to introduce the Vice Chair of Little Bear Forest Reform Coalition, Reverend Stoker, and she'll introduce her speakers.
Hi everybody. First of all, on behalf of Little Bear Forest Reform Coalition, I'm happy that everybody could come and join us tonight. I think we have an interesting program. We have 2 speakers tonight. We have Todd Rollinson. He's with the Forest Service, has been working with them for 10 years. He worked 8 years in research, and especially on thinning timber and improving habitat, especially with relationship to endangered species. And he is currently a wildlife habitat specialist and looks at a lot of the post-fire and how that's affecting the environment for these species. We also have Mark Hogan, who is from the New Mexico Game and Fish. I have to think about that because in Texas we always said fish and games. He's also been with Game and Fish for 10 years and 6 years in Santa Rosa and then now 3 years in Ruidoso. He is a law enforcement officer and deals a lot with wildlife conflicts. So, sort of issues that we're seeing a lot in the wildland-urban interface, and a field training officer. And they've coordinated our talk tonight, so we're going to talk about conservation and wildlife and habitat restoration and improvement, and pretty much cover everything. I think they're going to take questions about the meaning of life after. So, turn it over to these guys.
Hello everybody, my name is Mark Holguin. Like she said, I'm going to give a quick little presentation, or we'll start off the presentation with my portion of it. I'll talk a little bit about the department, population dynamics, conservation, and funding. Where does the money come from to pay my salary and manage wildlife in the state of New Mexico? We'll transition, talking about funding, into how that money is put on the ground, and Todd will talk about some of the projects that have been done locally using habitat stamp improvement money to do some of these habitat enhancements in the area. Also, I am the Ruidoso District Officer. My name and my cell phone number is up here on the board. So if you guys ever have any questions or any problems, this is the best number to get me at. I think there's another phone number in the phone book, and I'm hardly ever around that phone. You can leave a message at that number, but if you want to talk to me, call me at this 505 number. That's my cell phone. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just a little heads up. This presentation was is created to present to every 5th to 8th grader in the state of New Mexico. So we go to classrooms all over the state, within our districts, and we present this to 5th to 8th graders. We want to.
Guess we're in the right class.
Yeah. And no offense, but just to give you a heads up, it does start out a little bit kiddish. It shows like a picture of a gerbil and is asking, is this wildlife? We'll kind of skip through some of that basic stuff and kind of get into the meat and potatoes of it. Okay. And no offense, I know.
It's smarter than a fourth grader.
Yeah, there is that show, right? Right. So the mission of the department is up here on the screen. It's to provide and maintain an adequate supply of wildlife and fish within the state of New Mexico by utilizing a flexible management system that provides for their protection, conservation, regulation, propagation, and for their use as public recreation and food supply. And conservation, as you may or may not know, is the wise use of a resource. So if we take care of the habitat, if we take care of the wildlife and it's managed properly, it's a renewable resource that will have generation after generation. Wise use of that resource, which is wildlife. And of course, there's all kinds of uses for wildlife. It's just not all hunting. There's a lot of people who just like to view wildlife, photograph wildlife. They like to see wildlife in the woods when they go camping or in their community. In the case of Ruidoso, you can see just about every species of wildlife out of your kitchen window, you know, most places in town. So there's all kinds of values to wildlife. What is wildlife? Wildlife includes all free-ranging vertebrates in their naturally associated environments. Well, this is kind of where the kids giggle and really enjoy this part. And you guys may too. It'll show some pictures, and it's basically an elk wildlife. I think we all agree. You have a picture of a deer, bear. Speaking of the bear, I brought some information on some bear-aware issues. You're free to take, there's 2 pamphlets up there, just to educate yourselves or your neighbors on how to minimize that bear-human interaction. But if you guys have any questions about that after the presentation, then I'd be more than happy to answer those for you. Bear wildlife? Yes, definitely. Fish, that's a Rio Grande cutthroat trout. It is a vertebrate in its naturally occurring environment, so that'd be wildlife. Box turtle, horned toad, yes. Rattlesnakes, everyone's favorite, right? Burrowing owl, wildlife. Right, this. Some people do believe that domestic cattle are wildlife. It is not. It's not in its naturally occurring environment. It is a vertebrate, but as everyone knows, they are domestic, non-native dogs, kittens. We have a lot of feral cats in town. Domestic animals reverted to a wild state, right? Not wildlife, though. And there's the gerbil, or hamster, whatever.
Gerbils are wild somewhere.
You know, I bet they, yeah, they have to come from somewhere. They just don't run around in a little ball around their house. Okay, habitat. All living things depend on habitat, including us, right? Most of us, our habitat's a lot different than what an elk requires. An elk's going to require a lot more space, different food, cover, and we need space, food, cover too, right? It's just our space, food, and cover is a lot different than what an elk needs. Here's some pictures of some different types of wildlife. We have this, or different kinds of habitat, I'm sorry. Here's a picture of the typical mountain habitat you might find in New Mexico. Looks like some pretty high country, probably 9,000 to 10,000 feet. We have some of the same type of habitat in Lincoln County. Aspen forest, going up Ski Run, there's a lot of aspen forest. Wildlife utilizes this. If you look at the trunks of the trees, elk and deer do feed on the bark. Provides a lot of cover, and it sure is beautiful in the fall, right? In Lincoln County, we have this kind of habitat also. Prairie, different kind of wildlife in the deer versus in the mountains, right? We have more pronghorn antelope. Bison historically lived in this kind of habitat. Desert, we have a lot of desert in Lincoln County also. That's the one unique thing about New Mexico, in Lincoln County, even as a standalone, the diversity of habitats. You can go from, you know, some of the stuff, some habitat that looks a lot like this, just east of town, or on the west side of the mountain, and you're in cactus and dry, you know, desert hills. A lot of diversity in the desert. I grew up in Silver City, New Mexico. It's pretty similar to Ruidoso as far as the habitat or the climate. You're close, you know, to the mountains, just above 6,000 feet. Pretty similar. And so I always thought, you know, growing up, well, all the wildlife is here in the mountains and the trees. That's where the wildlife is. When I got this job, I got stationed in, well, between Artesia and Carlsbad. I trained out of Carlsbad, and you're in just a flat desert. And I thought, what kind of wildlife lives out here? And I was blown away at the diversity and the amount of wildlife in the desert. Just incredible. It blew my mind. Tons of deer, antelope, elk. You know, not as many elk, obviously. You don't have the bears like we do in the mountains and stuff like that, but tons of small game species, dove, quail. The desert is very diverse. Some locations in New Mexico, we also have desert bighorn sheep. And here's the habitat too, right? This is more for like city slickers, right? Some of us may prefer that habitat, and some people may prefer a more rural form of living. Can wildlife live in this habitat, or does wildlife occur in this habitat? Absolutely. Especially during times of drought. There's nothing to eat in the mountains. They can smell all the good food that people are cooking down in the city. They smell garbage, fruit trees, sources of water, golf courses, green grass. So there's a lot of draw, especially in drought conditions like we've been in for several years, that draws a lot of wildlife into these urban areas. And when wildlife is drawn into close proximity to people, there's a potential for a lot of wildlife-human conflict, whether it's wildlife getting hit by cars, bears getting into houses, wildlife injuring or killing pets, or exhibiting threatening behavior to people. When you come into close contact with the wildlife, there's always that potential. It's rare, but it does happen, and so it's just something to be aware of. Obviously, this habitat is much different than the last several slides we looked at. Here's just kind of a diagram of habitat and some of the components of it. So you have cover and shelter, right? Like this building provides us cover and shelter. And outside it might be rocks or trees or different slopes on a hill or a mountain that provide a certain amount of cover or shelter. Water, food, and space. Those are all components of habitat. You know, all wildlife depends on some form of habitat, and a different arrangement and different kinds of plants and soils and different amounts of water, etc. This is a pretty rare site in New Mexico. Water, but it's very valuable to us, right? And not only for fish, but for people to drink, wildlife to drink. And it's a huge limiting factor in New Mexico. That's one of the big difference between New Mexico and as you travel north. You go north just a little bit, even northern New Mexico is quite a bit different than down here. You go further north into Colorado, and it's just almost like night and day the amount of water. And there's typically more wildlife, or more types, not more types, but more abundant wildlife in areas where they have more water. So like Colorado has more deer than we do, typically bigger deer. They just grow more groceries, they get more rain, more snow, they have more rivers, streams. So water is crucially important, and an important habitat and component of habitats. We'll talk a little bit about population dynamics. Wildlife populations are not static. They fluctuate due to 4 processes: birth, death, emigration, and immigration. So like everything else, the effects of drought. that affects wildlife greatly. If it's really dry and we're not growing as much food, then we're gonna have a lower fawn recruitment or lower recruitment of any kind of wildlife. If they're struggling, if they have to work harder to get a full belly, they travel more, they come into more conflict, whether it's with people, predators, or other wildlife, competition for resources. So the population is always changing. On a year where we have a lot of rain, we get a lot of fawn recruitment, there'll probably be more wildlife the following year. If you have several years of drought like we've had, what's going to go down? The population of deer is going to go down. The population of elk is going to go down because there's not as much fawn recruitment. And then along with that, the number of predators that feed on deer will also follow that same trend and eventually go down as their food source becomes more limited. Deaths, wildlife, there's all kinds of reasons for deaths: old age, disease, hunting, accidents, predation, and then of course emigration and immigration. Wildlife is always moving in and out. They're free to move across the landscape in most cases. There are some natural barriers and a lot of man-made barriers that wildlife cannot cross, or it's very unlikely that they would cross those barriers. And that would minimize the emigration or the immigration of the population. A picture of recruitment, bighorn sheep. Every habitat has a carrying capacity, and what the carrying capacity is the number of wildlife that a certain habitat can support. In drought years, that carrying capacity is going to go down. Why? Because we're going to have limited amounts of food being grown. Less grass, less forage if we're talking about deer or elk. Limiting factors to carrying capacity: accidents and pollution, disease, starvation, predators, old age, hunting. There's a little leak in the barrel over there. Going to a bucket to account for hunting. So all the water that is lost out of this tank, which represents carrying capacity, are some of the limiting factors to that carrying capacity. One thing we see in town is, there's people who feed deer or feed whatever kind of wildlife it might be. What that could do is artificially inflate the carrying capacity. So now we have, where the habitat would normally support, say, 20 deer, now, because they're getting supplementally fed, now there's 100 deer in that same area. So when that food source disappears, then the wildlife are then left high and dry because they've lost that food source. So that could cause a whole bunch of problems: disease, damage to the habitat, overgrazing, creating browse lines, trails, erosion, that kind of thing. Plus more human-wildlife conflict, which I've never seen end well for wildlife. Usually always negative. Here's some pictures. We talked, I guess, immigration. The department has, since I believe the 1930s, I think it's in the 1930s when the Department of Game and Fish conducted its first capture and translocation of pronghorn antelope. And we still do that today with other species, to include deer, bighorn sheep, and wild turkeys. But the trapping and translocating of pronghorn antelope has been hugely successful. They do really well. Very high survival rates. There's some pictures. You see some old black and whites there. You could go to YouTube and visit the department's YouTube webpage, and they have some really neat videos from some of the first pronghorn antelope traps. It's pretty cool. I'm sure if you guys are from the Ruidoso area, I'm sure you've come across this scenario before. The bears in town. They're the only reason they're in town is because they're hungry and they know they can find food, whether it's in a dumpster or hummingbird feeders, or people are actually feeding them. We get a lot of calls about people actually hand feeding bears. They're a lot braver than I am. If I see a stray dog, I keep my distance, let alone a wild bear. So creates conflict. When this bear associates people with food, and it finds an open door or window in a house, there's a really good chance it's going to want to go inside and find some food. High calorie, you know, it's better than eating sticks and juniper berries out in the dry woods, especially in drought conditions. So, you know, they're just trying to survive. We try to educate the public as much as possible to live with wildlife, to minimize the conflicts with bears. So, you know, that includes everything from garbage management to, you know, picking up ripe fruit that may have fallen off the fruit tree, not leaving any kind of attractant, whether it's pet food or bird seed or hummingbird feeders that might create conflict, close proximity to people. That bear's looking for a way in. By the way, I've never heard in New Mexico of a bear coming through a glass window. If it's closed or glass door, I've never heard of that happening. Could it happen? I'm sure it could. It'd be extremely rare. When a bear comes into a house, it's usually because the window, the glass portion is open. It'll come through a screen, an open window or an open door. Here's a bear with an ear tag. I think this picture was taken in Albuquerque several years ago. I've yet to have a bear go up a power pole. We got so many trees around here that I think I'd rather just climb a tree than a power pole. And we do track and move some bears. If it's a human safety issue, we euthanize those bears, but we do move some bears. The issue that we've come across when moving bears is they always try to go back to where they're from. And in the process of going back to where they're from, after we moved them, they run into a lot of conflict with both people, other bears, and approximately 80% of the bears we move end up dying on their way trying to get back to town. So, you know, we stress trying to educate the public to minimize that conflict so we don't even have to trap and move them, because it usually ends badly for the bear. Wildlife is valuable. I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. There's all kinds, you know, some people value wildlife for the recreation, for hunting, for a food supply. I don't know how many people in here hunt or not, but it's some of the healthiest meat you could get. It also generates a lot of money, which pays for management of that wildlife through the sale of hunting and fishing licenses, and also through the Habitat Stamp Improvement Project. But there'll be a slide here in a second, but we're completely, besides some federal money through the sale of firearms and ammunition, maybe one other federal grant or something, one or two others. The management of wildlife is funded, and the Department of Game and Fish is funded through the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. We don't receive any money from the general fund. This picture shows, the top one is a picture of some elk. That's a success story through proper management, trapping and relocating elk. We now have a very healthy population of elk, whereas in the early 1900s they were eliminated from the state of New Mexico through overhunting, market hunting. Same with bighorn sheep, a lot of predator issues, but again, through proper management, regulated hunting, we now have more bighorn sheep now than we've had in a long time. Same with wild turkeys. But market hunting, poor management or no management at all, resulted in those populations of crash or being eliminated in Mexico. So like I mentioned earlier, this little chart kind of shows where the department gets its money to manage the state's wildlife. As you can see, the biggest figure there is license sales. So that's hunting and fishing, trapping licenses. The Wildlife Restoration Act provides over $5 million. I believe these figures are from 2012. So they're a little outdated, but it's going to be fairly close. There's a Sport Fish Restoration Act, share with wildlife, property disposal, citizen property revenue, general tax dollars is zero there on the right. Whenever somebody hunts or fishes or traps on federal land, which is U.S. Forest Service or BLM, by law, they're required to purchase what we call a Habitat Improvement Project stamp. And that's a $5 stamp you pay once per year, and that money goes towards habitat improvement projects on Forest Service and BLM property. And that's what Todd will talk about here in a second. Here's just a graphic of wildlife cycle of success. So hunters, anglers, boaters, and recreational shooting sports participants purchase equipment, licenses, etc. Manufacturers pay an excise tax on that equipment. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service allocates funds to state fish and wildlife agencies. State fish and wildlife agencies implement wildlife management programs and projects. The result is more wildlife, better hunting, fishing, boating, and wildlife-oriented recreation. And there's the rest of the slide, or the PowerPoint is just a few pictures of some of the stuff we do. That's a big old bear at the bottom. It's like a 450 pounder probably, if not bigger. That bear was captured and transplanted in northern New Mexico, somewhere in the either Las Vegas or Raton area. There's top picture there is a game warden truckload of a bunch of seized deer that were killed unlawfully. That's Mike Perry in that picture. We do a lot of enforcement, run roadblocks, check for compliance of the etc. And the department really pushes to get, the future generation involved in the management, in participating in, hunting, fishing, that kind of thing. So we teach a lot of hunter ed classes and give talks at schools and stuff like that to educate and promote the recreation. That's all I got. So Tom, go over his, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes of questions.
What is property disposal?
Just the auction of old vehicles and old buildings and stuff like that.
On public land?
That the department owns.
Oh,
They have a big auction in Santa Fe every year, every couple of years, and that money generated from the sale of the used equipment goes back into the wildlife protection.
Hey, Mark, where does feral hogs fit into this?
Feral hogs are not a game species, and they're not wildlife. Feral hogs are domestic pigs that just now live in the woods. So much like a feral cat, a lot of those cats were once pets. They didn't want them as pets anymore, so they let them out, and they do really well.
Can they be hunted without a New Mexico license?
Correct. There's no license, bag limit, or seasons for feral hogs. They carry a lot of disease and are considered a huge nuisance.
Are there a lot in Lincoln County?
There's some. I wouldn't say a lot. Wildlife Services has done a lot of population control on feral hogs.
Yeah, they've taken, on the north side of Capitans, they took, I believe, 87 out between last fall and this year. Not a large population if you look at the landscape.
If hypothetically, if one were to go out and hunt those, what kind of a weapon would you use to kill one of those? My sister, maybe?
I've seen spear license in Alabama.
Yeah,
That's pretty risky, but
a typical center fire hunting cartridge would work. I mean, anything that would kill a deer or an elk would be adequate for hogs. They can get pretty big, 300 pounds, I guess. I've seen a couple that have been killed here in Lincoln County, and they were maybe 150 pounds, and they look pretty damn big. One might have been pushing 200 pounds, and that's a big hog. So.
well, One thing to think about too, we do have wild populations of javelina, which are very different from domesticated feral swines. There's plenty of information on websites about those.
And that you are required for licensed vets, have they?
Yes, sir.